Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
You know, my friend Don Boudreaux has a lot of titles, including being a professor and former chair of the economics department at George Mason University. But just for fun, I'm gonna read my favorite title for Don. Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And with that mouthful of a title, allow me to welcome to the show my friend Don Boudreaux. Good morning, Don. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Ross. Good to speak to you again.
There's a push at the national level, but also, more importantly for me today, a push at the state level here in Colorado for legislation that they broadly call equal pay for equal work. In fact, that's the name of the bill here in Colorado, the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, basically arguing that legislation is needed to make sure that employers don't systematically, out of some form of sexist bias or capitalist misogyny, underpay women. You wrote a great piece for the American Institute for Economics Research. It's the kind of thing you think about a lot in a very Bastiat kind of that which is seen and that which is not seen way. So what's your take on paid leave? I'm sorry, equal pay. We'll come back to paid leave because they're similar.
My take is that competitive labor markets already supply equal pay for equal work. The evidence is overwhelming. You know, we have these statistics that women get paid only 77 cents. When you control for all the relevant economic differences, the gap virtually disappears. There's a very small remaining gap, and people dispute over what causes that. But the difference is really, really tiny, and it's within the range of what I believe is statistically insignificant, actually. So the market already supplies equal pay for equal work. Because, look, the market's highly competitive. And a lot of the same people who will complain that capitalism and markets are evil because they elevate profits over people, like people care only about profits. These are the same people who, when they assert that markets underpay women consistently, are asserting that entrepreneurs and capitalists intentionally leave money on the table. They intentionally don't hire the most profitable employees. If a woman is being underpaid, and I'm a greedy capitalist, I want to hire that woman away. And the way I hire her away is offering her more money. And then her greedy capitalist employer matches my offer or ups it. Her wage gets bid up to reflect the value of her work. And so there's no real evidence that women are underpaid. There's no reason in economic theory to believe that they're underpaid. And look, one further point. Who decides what is equal work? That's a very subjective matter that varies from job to job and employer to employer, industry to industry. You don't want bureaucrats sitting in some office somewhere in a state capital or in Washington, D.C., classifying which jobs are like which other jobs and which aren't. They're going to get that wrong, and it's going to be politically motivated anyway.
You know, and I just want to point out to folks, because these economic issues are quite similar, paid family leave and equal work for equal pay. So Don's article is about paid family leave, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Don, I just wanted you to know in the equal pay bill here in Colorado, it's funny because, well, I shouldn't say funny. The title is Equal Pay for Equal Work, but when you go to the actual text of the legislation that they are proposing. Check this out, Don. This says, an employer shall not discriminate between employees on the basis of sex or on the basis of sex in combination with another protected status, blah, blah, blah. Listen carefully now. By paying an employee of one sex a wage rate less than the rate paid to an employee of a different sex for substantially similar work, regardless of job title, based on a composite of skill, effort, which may include consideration of shift work and responsibility. How about that, taking it to a whole new level? Now it's not even the same work. Now it's similar work, and we have to include whether you're trying hard.
Yeah, I tell you what, if I'm a lawyer, I love that legislation because that language is vague enough that almost any the wage differences or salary differences would be subject to being challenged. under that legislation in court. So this is kind of a make-work piece of legislation for lawyers, as is so many pieces of legislation. But there is simply, even in a world in which everybody has the best intentions, there is no way that third parties can look at two different employees or two different jobs and tell by observing from a third-party perspective whether or not these two employees are doing the same kinds of work. The only real test for that is market competition. And if I believe I'm being underpaid and I can persuade another employer that I can produce more value, I can produce as much value for that employer as I'm producing for my current employer, and if he'll pay me just a little bit more, I'll move. The only test is competition. The test is not determination by bureaucrats or courts.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second, just because this is always so much fun to do with you. What about the argument? I will propose to you that employees are at such a disadvantage in terms of information that it's not really a competitive situation because they don't have a way to know what other people doing similar jobs are making, and therefore can't get into a fair negotiation, understanding the market parameters that you and I understand about markets for most other things we might try to either buy or sell.
So you're certainly correct to bring that up, because this asymmetric information, as it's called, or imperfect information, is a term commonly trotted out to justify this intervention and many other interventions, by the way. But on this front, it's clearly mistaken. The relevant possessor of information here is employers and not employees. So I'm an employer, and I know how much having a particular job performed is done, and I can look at my employees and see how much value they're providing for me. And I'm a self-interested guy. I want my profits to be as high as possible, and so I'm looking around at. I'm constantly on lookout for workers who can increase my bottom line, and so I look across the street, I look across town, and I see workers who I think are being underpaid by their current employers, and those workers might not know it. They may be perfectly happy. They think they're being paid well, but if I perceive that they're being underpaid, it's in my self-interest as an employer to offer them a higher wage, to offer them to come to work for me, because I will be able to employ them, and they'll produce more value for me and increase my profits. Markets constantly deal with information that's less than perfect. It's a myth to think that markets work only when everybody is fully informed about everything. If that were the case, then markets wouldn't work at all, and we'd still be living on the savannah. In poverty.
It's interesting. This, fits into what we're talking about here. One of the provisions of this bill here in Colorado would also prohibit an employer from seeking the wage rate history of a prospective employee.
So here's an example where the legislation itself would create artificial knowledge distortions.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's bizarre. What possible justification can there be for such a prohibition? I'm not even sure why employees would not want that information. Why good employees wouldn't want that information out there. About 5 years ago, a student of mine, Leah Palagashvili, who's now teaching in New York, she and I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal looking at what determines wage rates. And we found, as many economists do study this, we find that wage rates, in fact, keep up with worker productivity, which is what economic theory says. So as worker productivity rises, so do so does worker pay, wage rates, and fringe benefits. And this has happened since the beginning of the industrial age. It continues to happen today. So there's no evidence that workers are being underpaid. There's no evidence that workers in general are being underpaid. There's no evidence that workers of a particular sex are being underpaid. To the extent that there are problems in labor markets, it's created by government intervention. It's created precisely by this kind of statute, which throws knowledge imperfections, as you just mentioned, into the mix, occupational licensing restrictions. These sorts of things are barriers to workers moving and changing jobs. The market itself, when it's allowed to work, works pretty remarkably well.
Right. So let's move on to the other related issue, which was actually the first thing I got in touch with you to talk about, and your piece at the American Institute for Economic Research website. It's called The Economics of Paid Leave. And for those of you just joining us, my very special guest is my friend Don Boudreaux from George Mason University, and everybody should go to his website, cafehayek.com, and sign up for the daily email, and follow them on Twitter as well, CAFEHAYEK. So that's the Twitter handle at Cafe Hayek, and cafehayek.com, a brilliant website where you'll learn a lot. So also here in Colorado, Don, they are looking at creating a new payroll tax to fund what they're basically calling an insurance program for paid family and medical leave. And your piece is just so brilliant on this. We got about 5 minutes. So just talk about the theoretical underpinnings of whether this should even be or is necessary.
It's not necessary. Paid leave is a fringe benefit. It's a fringe benefit like employer contributions to health care plans, like employer contributions to pension plans, like employee discounts for retailers or at restaurants. It's a fringe benefit. There's simply no reason to believe that the market is undersupplying that particular fringe benefit. If workers want it, employers have an incentive to supply it in order to attract the best workers. Labor markets in the United States are very competitive. Employers, of course, wish they weren't, but they are. As I said a moment ago, worker compensation is keeping pace with worker productivity, which is evidence that they're competitive. If you mandate paid leave, government mandates paid leave, or otherwise intervenes in order to make paid leave more likely to be supplied, then some other form of worker pay will have to fall as a result. The government can mandate that. The example I like to use is, I really would like my employer, George Mason University, to supply me with a chauffeured limousine to take me to and from work every day. I would really like that. And at some price, my employer would be willing to do that. Now, if my employer does that, my salary is going to go way down because that's a costly fringe benefit. But if I want it, my employer would be happy to supply it. If you look at the evidence, actually over 50% of workers, actually over 60% of workers today have some form of paid family leave. Some workers don't want it. And when you start mandating these sorts of things, you restrict the market's ability to fine-tune and craft the particular ways that workers are paid according to worker preferences. It becomes a one-size-fits-all deal. Every worker has to get paid leave. Well, that may be valuable for a couple in their mid-30s who were thinking of having a family. It's not very valuable for a 17-year-old who is not yet married. It's not very valuable for a retiree who's having grandkids rather than children.
Well, don't forget, Don, as I often say, Democrats, liberals are happy for you to do absolutely anything that you want to do as long as it's compulsory.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second. But Don, a lower income worker, somebody making $23,000 a year, doesn't have a lot of leverage in negotiations with an employer, and they're likely, if a woman gets pregnant, likely to lose their job and have a huge hardship and not be able to afford to raise a child. So we really need to do this.
Well, look, if you do it, what you do is you wind up reducing that worker's pay in other ways. You're going to reduce the value of other fringe benefits or the value of take-home pay. There's simply no reason to believe that employers refuse to offer that particular fringe benefit. Employers pay these workers. Even low-pay workers are paid workers. So those workers are worth that amount. So if you let's take your figure of $23,000, and if you tell the employer, "Oh, look, you have to supply paid leave," the employer is not going to keep the salary of $23,000 and add paid leave to it. The employer will add paid to it, but then lower the employee's salary. How do progressives know that every low-pay worker prefers a portion of his or her compensation in the form of paid leave as opposed to having it all in the form of take-home pay?
I can't believe you question the wisdom of progressives, Don. They know all.
They act as if they know all. They have kind of a God complex.
As you know, Hayek called it the fatal conceit.
The fatal conceit. And what amazes me is not that some people are that conceited. What amazes me is that so many people are willing to grant to those people their the correctness of the presumption.
Okay, so I got about 40 seconds. What I want you to do is give me the good professorial wrap-up, sort of the combination of paid leave and equal work for equal pay, what you think about these things as an economist. Go.
I think that American labor markets today are actually highly competitive, and so they're working, and so the mix of pay, the amount of pay, is actually pretty much what it should be in competitive markets, to the extent that it's not. The problems arise not from competitive markets. The problems arise from government interventions into those markets. And all these programs, like legislated paid leave or legislated equal pay for equal work, all that will do is distort labor markets and make them less responsive to the workers of America and make those workers worse off in general.
Don Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University. Everybody, you got to check out the website, cafehayek.com. If you can't spell it, email me and I'll tell you. Don, thanks so much for the great conversation. Always love talking to you.
Likewise, Ross. Thanks, man.
Okay. We'll be right back. Call me if you want to react.
This report is sponsored by Staples.
Crowded highways for this Thursday morning drive. Traffic in Commerce City jam